Okay, this is the home stretch here. What is quite clear, the committee has committed that, as you heard, this will not be a doorstop. And those of you that know the committee members, it's not going to be a doorstop. So anyway, so Susan Hockfield, President Emeritus from MIT, and I will help try to facilitate this. And let me turn it over to Susan.
Oh, okay, that's how we're going to do it. So we actually made an effort last night to assemble some of the enormous number of thoughts into some kind of order. And but then, as I'm listening to today's report outs and further discussions, we only kind of just got started. But what we thought we'd do is give you our first thoughts on what we've heard in the organization. And we kind of broke it into needs that we've heard. So what do you need to effectively do this convergence thing? We might actually spend a little bit of time talking about what this convergence thing is, because I think we don't necessarily have a single idea. So having a little discussion about that I think would be helpful. And so there's a list of needs and there's a list of impediments, and they're a little bit overlapping. One is just the positive side and the other is the negative side of sometimes the same thing. So this is a, as yet, unfully reconciled list. But we want to just put it up here to elicit some of your thoughts on where we need to add and where we might take away. And I think that, where's Katie? Yeah, some of the follow-on from this meeting will be putting these lists into a little bit better shape, distributing them to you and asking you to actually, send back your thoughts, perhaps not at this instant, but in the week ahead, so that we can all distill what we've learned and bring all those ideas together.
Yeah, and I think clearly in the context of, I think the way Matt Terrell said it yesterday, I think everything has been said, just not by everybody yet. So yeah. There's an element of, the way the committees, the breakouts were structured. We try to have them come out from different perspectives, but you can see how they converged in some interesting way.
There's that word again. Yeah. Okay, so I guess what I will suggest is we'll go through these lists. We'll show them, and then we'll have some conversation about that. And at that time, I think I'd also welcome some thoughts on convergence as a theme. And then I want to kind of give a few comments on where I think we are. And Joe, you're going to close out after, sort of, or we'll see whether we close out. Okay. So these are some of the essential characteristics that we have heard about successful convergence. In three different categories. These may or may not be the final categories, but I like them. Starting with people, leadership is absolutely essential. And one of the things that we have heard is that leadership at many levels is essential. It's great to have a dynamic local leader, the person who actually does the hard work of bringing people who come from different worlds together. But doing that in an environment that does not support the effort is bound to fail. So having supportive department heads, deans, presidents, also is really essential for these to be successful. And because convergence is not one thing, it takes different forms at different institutions. It's a great opportunity to build from each institution's own strengths. And there are great opportunities to expand in complementary directions. This top-down and bottom-up, I often had to explain to people who asked me as president, why didn't I make things happen? And I said, well, if you've got something you want to have done and you want me to do it, that is the worst possible route, because I can't tell my faculty to do anything. All I can do is say what my faculty are doing, what their interests are. So I think that this bottom-up and top-down, you have to have the interest, the enthusiasm among the faculty, students in your community, but you have to have top-down support for it to be successful. Organizational, what we heard from a number of people who talked about their successful activities is that governance is really important. So you don't just kind of waltz out one afternoon and say, hey, let's put on a show. It is very important to be pretty deliberate about the governance of these complex organizations. Program management culture, I have to say, we are so structured around the individual investigator grant. And when you get to trying to put a multi-investigator grant together, multi-departmental, multi-school, multi-institutional, it just gets harder and harder and harder. And we don't have a program management culture. Most places, a few places do, where you have actually professionals who can help you do all the stuff that needs to be done to put these large, multidimensional grants together and actually to administrate them. Goal-oriented efforts, we just heard about that. Core facilities are very helpful, and we'll get to another slide that talks about what you can do for less than $100 million. I think that's part of the discussion that kind of got left out, but it's absolutely essential. What can you do in a non-budget increasing mode? And we're going to come back to that, but core facilities is something that really helps facilitate these things. Funding sources. If you have any money to spend, it sounds like seed money is a good place to put it to actually foster collaboration. Culture is always important, and I think we will probably hear as we talk about convergence more specifically a little later is how important it is to have an open, inclusive environment that values diversity. Involves a common language. You know, one of the places where these things are really hard and no one really thinks about it. I'm trained as a neuroscientist, and I forget that the way I think is biased by my education and my experience in neuroscience. And so when I talk to a mechanical engineer, I assume that that person is coming in with the same set of biases, and wow, couldn't be more wrong. And I think recognizing that there are different languages and different presumptions that are brought to the table and actually leaving space to understand one another, to admit that we don't understand one another and get to a common language has ended up to be critically important in many of the convergent activities that we put together at MIT.
And I think some of the things that we talked about is as much of being multilingual as a common language. It's really, you know, making sure that you spend the time on communicating and, you know, reinforcing the fact that, you know, we, as learning organizations, that we learn the most from those that we have the least in common with. And so as we think through that point, you know, understanding common language or being bilingual or multilingual is really critical.
And when we talk about education, so one of the greatest gift we can give our students is that they emerge bilingual or multilingual, so they're not just coming out with neuroscience jargon in their pocket, but a little bit of engineering jargon also. Various mechanisms for encouraging a melting pot for interaction, and some of these are simply repurposing activities you currently have, journal clubs, seminar series, coffee hours, beer hours around a specific topic. So events of various sorts, shared buildings or space, and obviously the local ecosystem. I think it's Bill Sharp that said technology gets transferred by 2 feet. Interactions happen by 2 feet also. And flexibility is, in our view, really critical because we're not setting up a new department or a new school. We're setting up a new way of doing things. Do you want to talk? Oh, sir. Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And just to, you know, so you see what we're doing. We're trying to frame, you know, sort of how we're going to report out and how we're going to organize it. But you know, one of the things we wanted to sort of get out were these essential characteristics of what it is we're talking about, organizing around these 3 groupings: people, culture, organizational. You know, what are any strong reactions? Refinements would be really helpful, perhaps, to pause and collect those right here. Yeah.
Bob, go ahead.
I guess the one thing I don't see there, maybe it's implicit, but it's the reward system and things like promotion and tenure and how that's handled. I think that's critical.
Can we pause and actually have this discussion? So go ahead, Joe, but I'm just thinking that this might be a good place to put in this conversation about what is convergence.
Can I make a comment?
Yep.
I was actually up here first. So I've really enjoyed sitting here and listening for the last day and a half, and I've been trying to digest and also relate to what we're trying to do at Stanford and what we think we're doing, which may not be convergence, because I agree, I don't like the word. It bothers me, maybe for the same reason, which is that I think the word implies a process of combining different elements to reach a stable solution. To me, that's what convergence means. And I'm still thinking about a better word, but that's why I like the X in BioX. The X to me is the sort of the interdisciplinary research that we're talking about, or the transdisciplinary research, is sort of, it rides a wave of the future, and it's always intersecting, inventing, discovering, accelerating, and moving on. So the idea is it doesn't reach a stable solution. The idea is that this is not a discipline. We're not talking about a new field that you can major in. We're talking about a means to an end, a method for promoting very rapid, very new discovery-based research. And I want to also address one of your topics on the list here. I mean, I find the list terrific, but the goal-oriented effort, to me, under organizational, is only part of what I think we're doing or can do at Stanford, which is the other part is actually really promoting fundamental research to create new knowledge at the intersection of disciplines. So it's not just about goals. That's wonderful. It's about, and about making industry-university relationships, but really promoting any intersection that creates new knowledge. So I feel like I wanted to say these things, so I feel like they're not quite captured, and I'm sure I haven't done a good job myself, but in either our conversations or the list.
Yeah.
I would say it's very powerful. The last thing we want is any connotation that we want divergent ideas and strategies and the whole ecosystem, and fostering a culture of, this transdisciplinary comes back as almost capturing a little bit better than the word convergence. And but we recognize that issue, and it's certainly not lost.
Can I say one other thing that you might consider? With flexibility, with the ability to really foster new areas, comes failure. And I kind of feel like we should say failure is okay.
And we should have sunsetting mechanisms to actually get rid of the failures, right?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, on Sand Hill Road, that's a badge of honor, right? And as long as you've taken a good swing at the plate, and it's how you learn. If you don't become a great pitcher until somebody hits a home run off you. I mean, you got to understand where that edge is, and you're not taking big enough risks without doing that.
Other thoughts on where our minds might be muddy about convergence?
First of all, I love the term convergence, and in terms of its the initial paper in science. But the question is, we've got to think about: are we defining this only in the terms that were initially developed in terms presented in science? Or are we talking about this as a field of, really for the future and for lots of other areas? I actually spoke at some place about convergence, and I talked about convergence between engineering and design. It was a school that had a great design school, and I talked about how can you look at interior design and do work in terms of convergence between engineers, civil engineers, and interior design. And so I think that, I know this is at the end of the whole meeting, is there, are we going to call this convergence, or should we be calling it something else like should we call it transdisciplinary? And I like the paper the white paper that talked about convergence, talked about the difference between multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary. And so I think that we should think about that. I just actually went online and actually went to the Oracle, something called the Urban Dictionary, and looked up the word transdisciplinary. And it says nowadays we have lots of scientific fields or disciplines, and that they're far away from each other. Many of them want to be interdisciplinary, and so we like to merge and mix some of these together to solve problems.
Yeah. Go ahead. Oh, go ahead. Over here for a second, and then back here.
So one thing that would be very helpful to synthesize the discussion over the past day and a half is to really see what works in the different environments. We saw these examples, and they're unique examples from very specific environments, whether it be states, whether it be institutions, or big cities, small cities, so many factors. And if this is going to go out to the community and want to do this, we really need to synthesize that, or at least give great case studies. People can say, okay, I want to use my institution. What's the best model that will work in one place?
Great. Yeah.
Just a real quick comment on the concept of convergence or convergence, that alone, adjective or noun. Is it a process or is it an outcome? Is it an end or a means? And what's the scope of convergence or convergent? Is it a research focus? Is that what convergence needs to focus on? Or is it a much broader scope of activity that includes not just knowledge and its outcome, but its application? I think many of us think we know the answers to that, but the point is it's been used in a confusing manner in both the preliminary writings that we've read and in the conversation here.
Your role in the committee was to come in and tell us the answer and not ask a bunch of questions.
Okay, I'll shut up now.
Yeah, Sharon and then Don. Sharon, sorry.
Yeah, so I have is Michael talking?
Sharon, go ahead, and then Don.
I wanted to make one comment, but first let me just respond to what Cato's suggestion about transdisciplinary. So I also dislike the word convergent. But when I think about what we mean by it, I think of the word, and I also dislike this word, but I like what it suggests. It's not transdisciplinary, it's transcendent. We're not just trying to mix different disciplines together, but I think what we want to do is mix different disciplines together so that something new and powerful emerges from that you would not have necessarily predicted from the individual ones themselves. But the other comment I want to make is as I'm staring at this list for essential characteristics of successful convergence, I realize that there's one thing I think we haven't talked about at all, which is what or who is threatened by convergence. And the thing that jumps to my mind that we struggled with a lot at my institution is the department and the department structure. Sure, it's easy to pick up a third of a department and move them over to this interdisciplinary or trans-convergent institute. But now we're over there mixing with those people, and we're not stumbling over our own departmental colleagues. So what does this mean for the future of the department? So it's something that we should think about as we talk about it.
Yeah. I was going to actually comment on something that's very similar to that, which is I think it should have the importance in the culture of building on the existing disciplines and showing respect for the importance of those disciplines and making it a win-win. I think Carla's point, and I think this is process, not an end, and I think so. You could be always striving for convergence, but never getting there, and that's what this is really about, I think. But I think this idea of being problem-oriented is what brings people together. It's trying to solve a problem, and it's needed. On the other hand, if you do that and you just throw away all the new insights that come out at the border of these fields and don't work with the people in those fields to advance their own field, then it's just, and I don't see that. It's almost like the opposite. It's here you're just saying this is what you need to do to get away from the existing, but it's not saying that you have to do that while helping build the existing as well, so it's a win-win. So I think there needs to be some comment there, and I think that's kind of what you were alluding to.
Yeah. So I think, but I'm not sure, is we're talking about a process, we're talking about a culture, we're talking about a methodology that is multifunctional. And we haven't grasped that.
But it's to build on and strengthen the existing.
Yes.
It's not a new school. It's not a new department. It's not a new, type of thing. It's something that should lift everything in.
Yeah, and I like what you're saying. It needs to be win-win, or we're just robbing Peter to create Paul, and Paul will be robbed by the next one. Yes. Yep.
So, well, I was also going to indicate something similar, and I like your term of win-win because it can't be either or in terms of the institute versus the departments. But the other thing I wanted to ask about, Susan, under organizational, you have funding sources, seed money critical. Was that to imply seed money for the institute? Because we could also put under culture seed money for joint projects for graduate students as they have at BioX.
Yeah. So thank you. So what we heard many places, and this may or may not be the critical element, of the incredible importance of seed grant money, seed research money, just to encourage people to have these conversations across disciplines that they are not encouraged by the current funding mechanisms, and just get them started so that then they can have something that's ready to...
And I totally agree with that. But there also needs to be institutional support for, like, the core facilities and the technicians to run the core facilities.
Okay, one more, and then I think we could...
I'd like to close by putting a very strong word in favor of convergence. The term is very clear to me, maybe because I've read quite a few papers that have been published in the last few years, maybe because I have been affected by Phil Sharp. That's how we started. The term is used internationally. Many of you don't know it, some of you do, that last year in Chengdu, China, we had an international meeting, a World Congress, in which there was a so-called session dedicated to convergence in the biomedical engineering field. And it went very well, and there were Europeans and Chinese and Japanese and so on. One last comment. Cato, I appreciate what you said about transdisciplinary. I think the term is going to be lost because people will confuse it with interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary. What is transdisciplinary? It's another Latin prefix, in some English word. And frankly, some people don't understand what trans means. They will think it's Transylvania disciplinary. Anyway, I am very much in favor of the word convergence.
I think if it were a Greek prefix, you'd prefer it, maybe.
That's it, Rob. You have a word. Yeah. Okay, this is the last one, and we'll move on and come back for more comments after we give you some more data.
So I just wanted to make one appeal to the committee here. I really appreciate the fact that you invited people who are under 40 to participate and listen today. I mean, I think it's very useful for our generation to be able to hear these discussions, especially the people who we really respect and who lead the community. I would strongly suggest that the committee really engage and ask my generation sort of what our view of convergence is and where we want it to be, because this would not happen without your leadership, in the room. However, you will not be the one who will live in the infrastructures and systems that you propose. Okay. So.
Yeah.
So I think that a collaboration between the generations here would be very powerful and allow us to sort of bring our views of the way that we think the science enterprise is changing and ways that we can help influence it. And I think it'll make it even more powerful.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great point. And one of the suggestions for a follow-on to gather further input from this meeting is actually to convene some of the younger members together so that you get a chance to brainstorm. And
one caveat to that as well is that as you know, many of my generations of scientists are not heading into academic positions, which does not mean that we're not interested in convergence or doing research or science. So please strive to look beyond just faculty members, but to reach into graduate students and people who are working in other science roles other places.
Those of us still in our 40s think it's the new 20. So.
Okay.
One thing in that vein, that there are many young people who trained in one discipline who now get jobs in other disciplines. Certainly my department has several chemical engineers, we have a pharmacology department. So when you reach out to the young people, try to hear people who have already gone into other older fields, if you want to call this. Most of us are pretty old.
Already internally flexible. Do you want to do these barriers, or do you want me to? Whatever.
So we tried to grab all the barriers that we heard in an organizational way, at least some of the top 10 or 12. Culture of mutual respect across disciplines, and coupling that's coupled to language and the willingness to learn another language and being multilingual. The challenge of bureaucratic overload, that's a big bucket that ranges from different policies at different institutions to policies within an institution, and some of the barriers for spanning departments and disciplines and institutions, and that's got to be looked at if you want to try to foster and we also use the word convergent sort of activity. The idea of seed money, we're really thinking heavily at the project level. This was heavily influenced. You'll see we have a list. Carol Fultz talked about as a public institution, things we can do within our current means without the big $100 million donation. You want to talk about the biology one?
Oh, I think, we've talked a lot about, with the physicists not being welcoming of the biologists, but our current way of training biologists, unless they're headed for medical school, can be totally math-free. And I think if we're going to bring forward a next generation that hopes to be bilingual, we've got to add to our biology curriculum some knowledge of and real facility with math. Is Emery still here in statistics? I think Emery left because he's got to operate. But this afternoon, he's got to anesthetize someone this afternoon.
I wanted a biologist to say that one.
Thank you. Okay.
It was your idea. I didn't. The disciplinary constraints on faculty hiring and promotion. We talked a lot about that. We grabbed your ideas. There's a lot embedded in that topic, but it's going to be, we're going to blow that out as a pretty comprehensive list of barriers. And again, barriers, we're using the word barriers because we're going to go around them. And so we'll look at it in that context. There was a lot talking about organizational that related to accounting structures and barriers and indirect cost returns. Some of the things that get in the way, that it take too long, and there was a lot about MOUs and some of these grand agreements in place to facilitate. We heard about Michigan and all these different places, so we want to grab some of those. One of the things we really want to point out, and this is a barrier on its way, and I think it's a tsunami coming, and we heard this, about this change for academic health centers. So remember, right, 35% of the federal budget ends up at 25 universities, right? And there's only 2 universities on that list without engineering, right? So the big funding agency here, is NIH, the big one. And the model there is changing at our academic health centers. We heard a lot about that, and all that extra money that comes into these centers has been supporting core facilities, science department, a lot of things. And, when you hear talk track about for people to be eligible for funding, that 50% of the salary has to come from their home institution, that's a game changer for the United States. And so there's a lot, there are a lot of research and it's consolidating. So we've got to think through the implications for that. Back in the 80s, 24 universities accounted for 40% or 30% of the output. Back in the 80s, 24 universities, 30% of the output, papers, patents, everything. Nowadays, 24 universities account for 42% of the output. Research is consolidating. The outcomes are consolidating. At the same time, the budgets have massively gone up. So we've got to think about the implications for that and how it's transforming healthcare, our healthcare centers who are funding a lot of things that go beyond, that are facilitating conversion activities. And, is NIH picking up that gap or what, the challenge is coming. And that's sort of related to the funding. Well, this is the funding model. This is what we talked about at the last session regarding how we review proposals, how proposals are treated. We caught that, and this idea that there aren't sugar daddies for everyone. And so this is, what can we do within our current budget to foster that sort of what we're talking about?
So why don't we go ahead and talk about that, and then we'll open up for further discussion. So one of the things that, as I say, even my head was kind of spinning with the number of dollars we were talking about yesterday afternoon. I mean, it's quite dizzying. But the fact is, we need a roadmap or to provide tools so that convergence can be practiced anywhere. That you don't need $100 million to get started. And so we wanted to provide some kind of a list of opportunities that any institution can avail themselves of. One is cluster hiring. I mean, you're going to hire some faculty. You can actually position hiring among several departments or between schools to focus on people who will participate in convergence activities. When we talk about the bureaucratic administrative impediments, I just say, my bad. I mean, it's our own fault. So why do we tie our faculty up in knots to make it hard for them to do multi-investigator grants or multi-departmental, multi-school, or multi-institutional activities? So I think, you know, we ourselves can work to reduce the bureaucratic boundaries or the administrivia. One suggestion was to bring executives and residents into the academy. Some places will be more receptive to that than others, but it can, and you know, frankly, engineering departments are more receptive to this than science departments. But I think in terms of facilitating the conversation along convergent themes, it helps to bring in people from industry. There's a suggestion of amplifying the online resources for convergence classes to be developed or identified. And the example I use, and it's kind of a surprising example, when MIT launched OpenCourseWare, and this was before I was at MIT, it was actually designed for faculty. So I know that the hardest part of doing a new course is actually putting the thing together. What do you include? What do you exclude? What's the order of things? And I always wish it would be helpful for me to be able to sit down on someone else's course and see how they did it. So that was the thinking behind OpenCourseWare, that the course materials for your course would be put online so that when I develop my new course, I would at least have access to those materials. And what a surprise that most of the users of OpenCourseWare weren't faculty, but independent learners. That moved that online learning in another direction. But we're now in a new phase of online learning that could be perfectly tuned to new kinds of courses in convergence. So whether they're entire courses on a particular topic, whether they're little lecture-esque Khan Academy-style pieces that can be added to an existing course. I think that someone else brilliantly suggested focusing on online resources to amplify current teaching or to design new courses. And that is a kind of a zero-cost thing. The encouraging social events and repurposing journal clubs, there are things that we do that can be not changed 180 degrees, but tilted slightly to encourage the kinds of conversations that allow people to come together in new ways with new ideas to foster these kinds of activities. Anything else, Joe?
So, again, this was not meant to be an exhaustive list. This was just a seed, some thoughts, but this is the kind of thing that after this meeting here too, you know, we'll send out an email to the participants just on this topic alone. We'd like to have an exhaustive list, as much of the participants here, because this is what we heard a lot of people talking about in a coffee room without the significant resources. What can we do already? What are the things that we're already doing that's working well? Collect all those, get this on this list, and it goes from large to small. But they're clearly within existing budgets, and we thought it'd be a value added to have that in this final report.
Yeah, and from the leaders of the convergence activities that are working really well, maybe with hundreds of millions of dollars, what are the free things? What are the cheap things that you do that have been really effective?
Yeah.
So shall we open up now for both our barriers list and?
Yeah, let's do that. So you want to start with?
Either.
Let's back up one.
Okay. We'll be orderly. Those
Yep.
engineers, they always want to be orderly. Rather than
we don't have.
maybe we can add that in. We'll see how the time goes.
Anyone want to comment on the barriers to convergence? Yeah. And please use the microphone, because we are capturing everything, and Joe Alper is insistent that we talk into a microphone.
Lydia Cabraki from Rice University. You invited comments to both topics. So something that I feel is very important, and I'm not sure it's coming out from the discussion, is to introduce convergence at all levels. That is, at the undergraduate level, at the individual graduate student level, at the interdepartmental level, at the university level, at the center level, and to make it part of the current practice, because in this way, you are going to lower some of the barriers. And I'm not sure what are the ways to do it, but having a discussion that helps people understand that it is part of the way things are going to be, and it has to be integrated with the whole system, might be helpful.
Thank you. Dan Solomon, NPC. As everybody knows, a lot of the barriers are barriers we erect ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if there are any lessons to be learned from which is not very expensive, I think, the NSF Advanced program, which was a culture change, is a culture change program in a specific domain, and would NSF be interested in a converge program, if you will? The idea being to make small investments in universities at low level to explore opportunities to facilitate convergence on their campus, and then disseminate their findings more broadly as Advanced does in its panels and website.
Interesting.
Sharon, do you know more about it too?
That's
the Michigan's
that's
supposed
a program
to
to promote the advance of women and people of color.
Here and then over here.
Many of the terminology and foci that we've seen so far are really very research-centered, and that's great, because that's most of the enterprise represented in this room. I'd like to say that if we're going to have conversations about convergence, and we want people to be multilingual, the younger you start speaking more languages, the better. Mm-hmm. So we have to start educating. We don't have K through 12 represented here. I'm not going to go there, but we need to talk about education. And at the same time we're dealing with convergence of disciplinary attitudes, the other thing we need to keep in mind, I'm very happy the younger than 40 spoke up, is that we're dealing with much more divergent career trajectories. We cannot assume that the undergraduates and the graduate students whom we are training are going to turn out to be university professors. And we cannot assume that they're somehow lesser if they don't do that. So at the same time that the disciplinary attitudes are converging, we need to prepare the people we're training for diverse career trajectories. And I really haven't heard that per se, rather than just, well, be part of a startup. But there's much more than that going on.
Yeah, I think Bill Harris had some great comments too about that educational piece and the culture for the economy of states, and we'll get that in for sure. Really?
I'm in and out of a lot of campuses helping people try to create interdisciplinary campus cultures and increasingly transdisciplinary initiatives. And I'm fond of saying there's not a problem you can throw at me that I can't give you a solution for, but it might not work here. And I think it's a very important thing. Susan said a number of things that really come together for me, painting a kind of perspective that we should echo. You said to begin with that we have to realize convergence takes different forms in different institutions. And if we start talking about methods, there's a multidimensionality to it. And so then later you called for a roadmap of schools that could happen anywhere. And what's striking about what we see is some of them are big ticket, some of them are mid ticket, some of them are very small. You had some great ideas for things that could be pulled slightly, but we would also still have large sugar daddy, sugar mama initiatives. I was struck a number of years ago by the University of Massachusetts Lowell, which floated a proposal to create an interdisciplinary campus culture that's still sitting on a shelf. It didn't fly anywhere. It had a lot of big ticket items, but it also had the 10 no-cost, low-cost ways to start to change the culture. Whenever I do consulting, I always make sure it's my last slide, but I don't give that away first. But I mean, there's common sense things like have prefix codes, lock sinks into the registrars, sinks into recruiting. So we need this range, and I think Susan has given us a very healthy perspective to take here.
So we really want to grab all these points, so let's go right, left, real quick. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Monica.
So I was going to follow up on something Rob had mentioned. Looking in and through some people who have gone through these conversion centers, so an example that I'll give you that didn't come up here, but at MIT there's a place called Center for Business Management. I got my PhD around there, and it's a very strange place. I have applied mathematician on one side, and a laser physicist on the other, and a molecular biologist. Yeah, and there is something that it does to you. And I think now I was talking to a friend before coming here, and I said, I don't really have a way to say this. And he told me, what you're talking about is in the past, this is a historian of science, that there used to be a single eye, that it became that you have to get a PhD, there is a T. You have to one depth and one broad. And then suddenly it's almost inverted U or M, that you're really actually talking about people in the next generation coming up, that it's, what does it mean that biologists are averse to math? The word biologist will change in a sense that we won't be saying that let's retrain these people. It would be something that the word biologist would not have the same meaning almost. And so I wonder if that, this is related to training per se directly, is that what we're actually trying to do?
Hi, I'm Stephen Marcus. I'm at the National Institute of General Medical Sciences. John's predecessor, Jeremy Berg, hired me with the following mission. And that was basically to bring convergence not only amongst the engineering and physical sciences, biological sciences, but also the social behavioral sciences. So I would like to argue that not only are the humanities and social and behavioral sciences important because the knowledge that they bring to bear is important in solving problems, but also we're the ones that study the science of collaboration and the science of gaining mutual respect across discipline, sort of thing. So that's my little plug, and love to help with that.
Can we pause at that point for a moment? That's something we've been doing a lot of debating about, is the scope of what we're referring to. And it's an active, there's a lot of really strong points on all sides of this. And I don't know how you want to proceed with the conversation.
I don't either. Joe and I can just duke it out ourselves up here. But what I would love to hear from you, if you have views about this. And I think one way to think about it is that it's multifactorial. Anyone can play. That's what convergence is. Or at this moment, the convergence we're talking about is something that is somewhat narrower, bringing biology into the convergence that already happened between the physical sciences and engineering. So, they're just different models of what we mean, and you're advocating to include social sciences, is what I hear.
I'm going backwards from the problems that we're trying to solve.
Yeah.
And so many of them are related to behavior. That to take that up. And I think a group like this can also raise this sort of issue as how important it is, especially at a time where NSF is continuing to be under attack about this, which is these sciences are incredibly important. They're much more important than people acknowledge many times. And I think the opportunity to weave it in some ways is too great.
Yeah, and I'm falling heavily in that camp. And as we go into the BRAIN initiative, you think about Google Glass, and how it's going to, the science of learning and all these things. This is so much a social process, perception, all these things. I think there's too much opportunity to be left off the table if we don't embrace this and encourage it. And Kleiner Perkins has set up a new $250 million fund just for companies based off Google Glass. There's going to be so many really cool things coming out of the woodwork that are going to go well beyond the kinds of things that most of us were contemplating. There's a strong argument to be made for embracing that holistically now.
And some of the examples, so there is a funding announcement that I had out on the street, and we're funding 8 grants as a result of that. And when the community sees those 8, we've achieved a certain amount of convergence between those three already. So I think they're really good models for how these things occur. And NIGMS is committed to continuing to do this. And so I just think this would be a great opportunity. I like that. I'm willing to help, but however you would want to, I'd like.
And Arvin Stanford. On the topic of barriers to convergence and also what can we do without additional resources, a barrier that we have tried to work around is the emergence of leaders. Because when you are asking, in our context, faculty to take on a leadership role, this is a very unfamiliar leadership role historically in some of our universities. We luckily have this tradition of some long standing, and we have ways of doing it. But even so, I think if we expect faculty to take on these leadership roles, we do have to understand that we have to support them. What are some ways of doing that? And again, it's not more money. We have a leadership academy for our faculty leaders and senior staff who, luckily, we have a business school that can teach in that setting. But just moving them forward with their skills. It's one of the things that typically comes from our bottoms-up discussions of potential new institutes, is that with the faculty working groups, very, very frequently, one or a couple of people will emerge and be recognized as that group as the leader that they'd like to have. And so how to empower that process, how to reduce the barriers. It's not like being a department chair. And what's gratifying from my point of view is that people who would literally never be a department chair are very successful in the roles of directors of our institute. And so the other thing that we do have to put in place for them is some kind of a director who can be helpful in managing the financial aspect, the personnel aspect, but a very small administrative team to help our faculty accomplish these goals. It's also, parenthetically, a sign in my experience. We do pay attention to the sunsetting. If there's no faculty member who wants to lead one of our institutes, it's finished. It's just a very good sign. A couple.
Really important point. Thank you.
Matt Terrell, University of Chicago. One quick addition to this, just for the sake of completeness, is something about dealing with lack of proximity. We have multi-institutional things. So how do you successfully deal with lack of proximity? Yeah. I have my own opinion about the terminology and the scope, and I'll try to keep it really quick. I'm perfectly okay with the terms convergence and convergence. I think it is a process. I think it would be hard for this group to claim the noun as what convergent science is, and I kind of like convergent science better. We're going into a new building at the University of Chicago, molecular engineering, which we're going to share with astrophysics. We're thinking about a center for astrophysical detectors using our nanofabrication thing. It's convergent, but it doesn't have anything to do with life sciences.
Quick comment. Item number 5, disciplinary constraints on faculty hiring and promotion, probably contains this issue, but I think it's important enough that it should be explicit, and that is academic credit for everyone involved in the team, for key people in the team. I think this is a substantial practical problem. I've seen it when I was in academia, before being in the government, and I also see it at the NIH.
And I would add Michael's comment about credit on review and that whole thing. So that's a great clarification.
Ron Germain from NIH, and I want to invest in a little constructive deconstruction, creative capitalism, sort of following on from Bill Harris's comments this morning. All these things are wonderful. I've participated, and I hope I've contributed to some of the discussion. But in the end, we're trying to sort of nuance how we go and do this within an existing system. And what hasn't really been discussed is whether we're getting to a point in, let's call it the biomedical or scientific enterprise in the country, in which one needs to do a bit more forward thinking about whether we need to do reconstruction of how we do this. And we don't have time to go into all the details, and there's some offline discussions here, but this is something that doesn't get brought up to the high levels in public fora, and it seems that the Academy is the perfect vehicle, or at least initiating a discussion to say that it's wonderful to add this, well, incrementally on top of what we're doing, and to make sure we preserve what we have and not throw out the baby with the bathwater. But are we really doing this right going forward? And this is just an example of where we're trying to make it happen by jiggling the pieces that exist and tuning around the edges where maybe some larger changes would be useful. And I think that's an important component of whatever comes out of this if you don't want a doorstop, because that's a big problem that seems to always get buried in a discussion of trying to nuance the fine points.
Right, so I'm very sympathetic with the danger of all this and more. Which, right. But on the other hand, as an experimentalist, you don't leap to discoveries 3 miles down the road. It happens step by step, and I view these kinds of convergence efforts as basically a laboratory to fiddle around, see what works, and it may be that out of this will come a revision of a biology program. It may become a breakdown of the boundaries between schools of engineering and schools of science, but I don't know that we can, from where we are now, envision what that future is. And so I view this as exactly kind of the route to get to what you're suggesting, which is we're going to have to replace something. What it is we're going to replace and what we're going to replace it with, we can't know yet.
Well, that's science on the academic side, but I was also referring to our whole funding mechanism. All right, that there is not a big discussion about whether the way we do things for junior faculty makes any sense at all in terms of getting them started in their careers, where they're basically told spend half your time and you should be in the lab going and writing grants because otherwise you can't proceed anywhere. We do prospective awards, which most people know are largely, well, I had to do it already to get it anyway, as opposed to retrospective reviews, which Howard Hughes does, actually NIH does, and which, despite what the financial community says, is the best way to predict future success.
That's right.
Rather than what you write and what magnesium concentration you put in your grant so they can dump it out because it's wrong. And that's what I'm talking about. That, yes, you can't whole hog change it, but I think this might be a place to begin to introduce the question of whether we need systemic or systematic changes in the system going forward to best support the optimal enterprise without always asking for increasing resources. But you really have to revamp it and not just tweak it. It's like doing across-the-board cuts, which is what's been going on at NIH for all the grants, rather than saying, no, what are the programs we need to expand and which ones are just not making it.
Thanks for pointing that out. I resonate too when Bill talked about that. And you know, it would, and I think it was outside the scope of what we're charged with today, but having a placeholder, I think it'd be interesting to have that conversation, because that's a wicked problem in the clearest, you know, in the most way. If you had a clean sheet of paper, how would you redo what we do today? And to, you know, we do stand on everyone's shoulders here, and you go through that analogy of why are the space shuttle rockets the diameter they are. You go through that story because that's where they can ship on a rail car. And that's, you know, why are rail cars that way? Because wagons made them. Who made the first wagons? They can get through an arch in Rome, maybe Greece. So the space shuttle rockets are the diameter they are because that's from 2 horses' ass diameter. So that's the way we kinetically get to things. But that's the way things happen. But if you had a clean sheet of paper, how would you redo it? And it'd be interesting thought, and maybe a funding agency, you know, private foundation to think through, you know, a think tank that would actually come at, and if you were to do it differently, what would it look like? It might be an interesting discussion.
Yeah, Sharon. On your question of including or excluding social sciences from what we mean by convergence, I think that Matt has it exactly right. We are talking about convergent science, not necessarily convergence of everything. But by its definition, convergent science is inclusive. So I think the last thing we want to do is exclude any discipline or any people from that, because everyone has something to contribute to these big moonshot type problems that we're talking about. I will also say that the advanced program, which is the most successful program across the country in promoting the advancement of women in science and engineering, at least at my institution, would never have been successful, and it's been extraordinarily successful. It would not have been without the social scientists and the members of our psychology department in showing us how to do it right.
Hi, Reg Kelly. I would like to make concrete suggestions to the organizing committee. I want to suggest that when you communicate with us after this meeting, you ask us to tell you 3 things that we think, 3 deliverables that would be most impacted if convergence was funded. Right? So, for example, one of the things, if I were asked to do this, it would be probably systems pharmacology, because here you have to bring control theory from engineering in with pharmacological work, so that's why it would have to be done. The deliverable would be to try and get a rational polypharmacy, which would have a big impact on cancers, we know that. So now the advantage of having a collection of suggestions from the audience here like this would serve 2 functions, I think. One, it would help us design a curriculum, right? If we're trying to think how to teach convergence science, we need to know where we want to go. And I think if we knew some of the things we all agreed where we wanted to go, we'd know how to create a curriculum. And the second big advantage is when we go to funding agencies, we'll be able to say, well, if you give to us, this is the sort of things you'll get back.
I just wanted to reiterate sort of the generational issue going on here, because I think most of the people, at least from my training time and what we heard earlier around the same time, we did convergent education by choosing classes in engineering, science, biology. So it was already done. So I would say a lot of us would be like, why are we talking about this? But it hasn't reached, now I see that it hasn't reached the upper level institutional stuff. But I would say from the ground, this has been happening for, a couple of decades from the educational perspective. Students, fellows have been trying.
Vivek Wadhwa, my conclusion after listening to all of these discussions for the last day and a half is that the current system can't be fixed. That really we need to do what you just said, is come up with plan B. The fact is that you will not be able to change academia, you will not be able to change the silos, the barriers, the funding mechanisms. Even now, most of the funding goes to these old professors who are completely out of touch with reality. Their focus is on writing more papers, getting tenure, defending their current turf versus saving the world. The only solution I can see is to let the next generation do it, which means that the students, the difference between before and now is that the cost of developing technology has dropped exponentially. You can create a world-changing startup for $50,000, $100,000. You don't need as much $1 billion grants. You don't need to have office buildings. You don't need to have the old line structures. So therefore, what you have to do is now create a Peace Corps coming out of the schools. These kids who now go and learn from different professors, and they do the innovation. That, in my mind, is the only solution that will work in the short term.
If you want to be provoked on a daily basis, follow Vivek on Twitter. And you'll get a barrage of these thought-provoking points. Thank you.
There have been a lot of very appropriate suggestions and interesting suggestions made in the last few minutes. I think, however, and I'll say as a member of the Academy, this is going out under the Academy's name, and it's set up by the Board on Lifestyle. So I think you have to bear that strongly in mind. And on the other hand, it will be seen in general. And I think that's why I wonder how thick the title is. There are various things. You could talk about transdisciplinary convergence, for example, if you want to experiment. That might at least make it a little more intelligible. It's going to be looked at by members of the Academy who are not necessarily life scientists, quite a few of them. The National Research Council, which sets this up and is where all the staff come from, is often under criticism from Academy members. And so a lot of these issues that have come up, I think, are very valuable ones, the social sciences in particular, but they're ones that the Academy needs to think how it would like to go about it. And so all I would like to say is that I think you should try out various titles. You might want to run them by not just the NRC, but some of the other Academy members in other areas. And I, again, urge you to put something in
about explaining the background. If there is the paper that originally was there, well, it would be worth mentioning. When I was invited to come here, I was totally at a loss to know what this was about. And I say this as somebody who's certainly worked from a theoretical physicist and have worked as a mathematician, and I've worked as a chemist, and I've worked in the biophysical area. And the bottom line is the term is not that general. And so again, I urge you to have a look carefully at the title and how you can go with it, and try and put it back by some of the Academy members. We want this to be, it's a very important issue. We want this to be an effective report, and I think you're going to make it more effective by paying close attention to, well, what are the 4 or 5 principal recommendations? I'm left with the impression that some of the real barriers at the higher levels, in the institutional levels. And so I would personally like to see strong recommendations as to the tenure issues and the easing of the barriers. It seems to me those are some of the crucial ones that have come up and where this report might have most effect. But I urge you to try and keep it short. There's a lot of things that have come up which I'm a lot of sympathy with, but on the other hand, I want this to be an effective report.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eric Naraki. I'm from Janelia Farm. I just had a quick comment about another way you can, I think, use graduate students to, in the case where you don't have a lot of money to start a new institute. So I went to Washington University in St. Louis, and I have a PhD in computational biology. It's from the biology department, genetics department. And as far as I know, they just started putting computational biology on PhDs. They didn't start a new department thing. And by just giving that degree, it attracted students who were interested in that area. There was, we thought there would be jobs in that area, so we came to the school for that program. And so, and essentially the graduate students would go there and were forced to have faculty from both computer science and biology on their committees, and so they kind of were forced to create this collaboration. They didn't know anything about the politics of, the divisions between departments or anything, so they were, fostering the collaboration themselves. So it's just something I don't think has come up. It seems to me like an inexpensive way to initiate this type of class.
Yeah, great observation. Thanks. Bob?
So, I don't know if Yogi Berra deserves credit for this, but sometimes he is credited. He said, it's very difficult to make predictions, particularly when it's about the future. So, as much as I am personally interested in convergence, driving solutions to the major problems of society, I don't want this report to lose the idea of promoting new knowledge, basic discovery research, and I think that can happen through convergence at the interface of disciplines, which may have been the comment you made, Susan. I can't remember. Somebody used that term, though. New knowledge at the interface of disciplines.
Yeah. Oh, we have another slide? Ah, right. Okay. Yeah, so let me give a little preamble to this, which is that I'm now old enough to have seen a few, at least transformations, if not revolutions, and I think this last day and a half had really called out that it is an extraordinary moment. We have heard from great academic leaders, and to pick up Ann's point, great academic leaders do not emerge every day, but when there is something about which people are passionate, you can actually incubate leaders in ways that you can't in standard practice. And so for me, it's one measure of when something really new, really exciting, and really important is happening, and it's happening now. There are a lot of convergence activities going on. I would say necessarily characterize the leaderships and participants as renegades and revolutionaries, but in a little way they are. because they're going against the grain. And what's very clear, I think, to everyone in the room, is it's happening. So convergence is happening, whether it's been happening for 20 years or 25 years, and the students say, well, I mean, this is the way I was raised. What's new? The point is that there are those who know, but many who don't know. And to my mind, this is a moment for us to fan the flames. So there are some, the fire is going, but we really need to increase the visibility of the effort, increase the enthusiasm for the effort, obviously increase the funding for the effort, but basically, it's something where it can be known to those who are as yet unaware that this is happening. And believe me, I travel around the country and around the world. This is a brand new idea for many people, although, again, for those of us in the room, it's as plain as day. One of the signals and one of the important pieces is the students and the young people who are enthusiastic about this, who grew up this way, can help in carrying the next step. The next step has to include advocacy. And so one possible recommendation from this day and a half is a national convergence initiative, or whatever we're going to call it, perhaps on the order of the National Nanotechnology Initiative. There have been a number of these things that have really changed, certainly perhaps not the face of what's going on, but the buy-in, the visibility of what's going on. And part of the excitement around this is it is a roadmap for innovation. When we talk about, I think that convergence can be played not just as a way of generating new knowledge, and I think it's critical that we understand that bringing people together who have different perspectives changes the way we do basic science, basic research. It also changes and accelerates our progress toward product. We're in, to my mind, a crisis time for American competitiveness, and as citizens and as academics, I think it's part of our responsibility to figure out what we can do to build American competitiveness. And increasing American ingenuity has been our tried and true method, and the convergence gives us a vehicle, a direction. So one of the things we want to talk about is whether a national convergence initiative seems a reasonable idea to you, whether it seems foolhardy, whether it seems ridiculous. And so we want to get some input on that. And if we like the idea, we need to organize a follow-on activity from this gathering, this workshop, to think through the pretty hard steps of what needs to be done to move toward a national initiative around convergence.
A reaction.